How's it going, everybody? It is 5:30 on Tuesday evening. Sorry for the delay in the recording, but, things happen. It is time for this week's episode of Riding in Cars with Cards. This is a show where I'm talking specific formats, specific card choices, deck techs, historical pieces, whatever we can to apply the lessons that we learn in Homeward Path each week. So, this week, I wanted to talk about something very, very specific in Homeward Path. So that is leading me to cover a deck that I honestly didn't think I'd have a chance to cover again. And it is the deck that Nick played when we played Grand Prix Memphis back in February, I think. Yeah, it was like right after the release of Ravnica Allegiance. It had been out like a couple of weeks. I had barely gotten my cards in order to play. So, excuse me. Let's set the stage before we start trying to break down the concept and the reason this deck is a good one to learn from. The format as a whole, the standard format had just had Ravnica Allegiance dropped into it. Players had not yet realized that Mono Blue Tempo was actually the best deck. The most popular deck in the format was Sultai Midrange, and it wasn't particularly close. We had Sultai Midrange, we had like Mardu / Boros Angels variants, we had some variations on Rakdos Aggro, Rakdos Midrange. We had the Gruul decks hadn't yet come to an arrangement as to what they wanted their decks to look like. Some of them were more mid-rangey with more planeswalkers. Some of them were more aggro-centric with a really, really lean mana curve and a lot of burn spells. The pillars of the format as we went into Memphis, the decks we identified as the ones we needed to be able to beat, were the Teferi Hero of Dominaria decks, whether it was Esper Control or Esper Hero, Mono Blue, Mono White, Mono Red. And when I say Mono White, I mean Mono White, White Red, and White Blue aggro, which were, the white weenie decks. They were the get on the board really fast, beat you up a whole bunch and hope you die. You would either play it lean and play straight white mana in order to not have to worry about stumbling on colors of mana, or you would splash for cards like heroic reinforcements in the Boros lists, along with some burn spells, or you would splash for I guess this was more so an epidemic after the release of words failing me here. More so an epidemic after the release of War of the Spark that White Weenie really started splashing blue a lot more heavily. But even just going into Memphis, the White Weenie deck splashing for, I don't know, stuff like Negate, Dovin's Veto, Deputy of Detention. These were all things that were being done. But in particular, we knew we needed to be able to we needed to be able to answer fast creature decks in Mono White, Mono Red. We needed to be able to have a game plan against Mono Blue, which was going to punish mana inefficiency and, either string the game out longer if it needed to, or just take a tiny advantage and snowball it into your face. It's kind of Mono Blue's MO. It's what they did. Or we were going to have to be able to play against really, really grindy long game decks, whether they were playing Thought Erasure or Explore Creatures and Hydro Crisis. And of course, there were the variations on Wilderness Reclamation decks, be they Teamer for Expansion Explosion, or just lean Simic or Bant for Nexus of Fate. That's what the format looked like. We had, ironically enough, we had everything a standard format could ask for if it wants to be a balanced and diverse format. We had fast aggressive creature decks. We had mid-range creature decks. We had a blue sort of tempo aggro control shell. We had pure control, tap out control, and then we had combo. It was like every archetype was represented. You can even argue that the Wilderness Reclamation decks that are playing the Expansion Explosion were combo control, while the Simic decks, the Simic and Bant decks, were more just linear combo. Even if your combo is Nexus of Fate plus Search for Azcanta, it's still technically a combo. It's an interaction between two cards that wins the game, even if the way you win the game is by your opponent getting frustrated, flipping the table into your lap, and leaving. I don't like Nexus of Fate, in case you couldn't tell. So, we all set out to attack this format in a different way. And me personally, I just stuck with what I've been playing the most. It was a deck that I was really comfortable playing. It was a deck that I enjoyed playing, and that was Mono Blue. I picked the deck I knew the best. I didn't really try to reinvent the wheel anywhere. The one kind of weird thing I did is what I seem to do every time I play a blue deck with a lot of counter spells in it, is I would play with the numbers a little bit and try to fit in a handful or 2 or 3 one-of counter spells that I could just make my opponent think about. A card like Quench, which is in the abstract, if your opponent knows you have it, it's not very good. But if they don't know you have it, and moreover they don't know how many you have, when you get them with the first one, they'll be playing around it, or they won't and they'll win. But some amount of the time, playing some one-of counter spells in the main deck has always served me well. And that was not an idea that was lost on the other people that went with me. Pablo and Nick both went, and they both played Sultai Midrange. Being the most popular deck in the field, they believe that, several thousand deck lists on MTG Goldfish couldn't be wrong. And it was, the deck that got to play the largest concentration of powerful Magic cards. However, the two of them arrived on very, very different lists, and I'd like to think my level of input on one of them is part of the reason for that. So, Sultai Midrange at the time, in its stock form, was configured pretty simply. You were a mid-range creature deck that had access to long game card advantage via Hydra Crisis. Even if your opponent counters it, you get to draw cards, which means you can just gas up in the middle of the game when both of you are just kind of sitting there not doing anything. You can just jam a Crisis down your opponent's throat, draw 4 cards, and set up to start trying to pressure him again the next turn. Your Wild Growth Walker into Jadelight Ranger draw is still a ton of pressure on your opponent that they have to deal with. Kaya's Wrath did a reasonable job helping with that, but for the most part, it was something that was just not very... It was not conducive to the control decks being in a good spot. And even if they managed to catch all the way up, it didn't really matter because you just go over the top of them with a Crisis. And Pablo was perfectly content to just take a stock list, make a couple of minor adjustments, and go from there. Play an extra copy of this removal spell on the board, play an extra copy of this disruption spell on the board, this, an extra planeswalker in the board, that kind of stuff. Nick, on the other hand, decided to be a little bit more of a renegade because he had lost to several variations playing this particular package that he wanted. And the more I thought about it, the more I loved it. So we really pushed that first, which was to play Hadana's Climb in the Sultai Midrange deck. Similar to what Snakes and Ladders had done at, ironically enough, Grand Prix Memphis the year before. Playing Hadana's Climb in what was otherwise just kind of a black-green creature midrange deck, and using Hadana's Climb as your method of being a haymaker and literally going over the top by granting your giant creatures flying in double power. It's really hard to lose matchups where the game gets into a kind of a gummy ground battle when your giant 6-drop creature takes to the sky, or your 6-drop creature simply outpaces theirs. So, Hadana's Climb had its really strong points. Most notably, if you played Hadana's Climb on turn 3, And then on turn 4, you went, I don't know, Wild Growth Walker, Merfolk Branch Walker, move to combat, put a counter on either one of those. Probably the Wild Growth Walker just to keep it out of Lava Coil range. Well, now you're starting to push ahead. You've got an advantage. You need to press it. Your Wild Growth Walker gets big enough like you've played a Jade Light Ranger, but you've actually double spelled and applied pressure at the same time. And then the next turn, the Hadana's Climb would put the third counter on whatever, or they'd kill the thing, and you'd go like extra explore creature. If you have the Jade Light Ranger, you play the Jade Light Ranger, explore, hopefully hit 2 cards, and then when you move to combat, you put the third counter on. It flips immediately, and that gives you your 5 and 6 drops a turn early. Now, the other framework for the Sultai Midrange deck that was in literally every list was to play a ton of mana creatures, so that you could cheat down your land count a little bit, and you would cheat your land count down a hair, and you would be able to ramp aggressively into your big plays. Well, in testing the Mirror, which was what we expected to be the most represented deck at the event, Nick was losing a lot of Mirror matches to his opponent killing his mana creatures. So we started looking at alternatives. We reasoned that we could bump up the land count slightly, play 20, 25, or 26 instead of 24, because Krasis was going to reward us for flooding anyway if we drew it. And then we ultimately decided to play more ways to interact with the powerful sideboard cards that people were going to bring in the main, because we were running out of sideboard space. Most notably, we didn't want to get caught with our pants down against Thief of Sanity, which was just an absolute haymaker in the Mirror, and it was something we ended up moving to the main. We wanted to be a little bit more proactive as the Sultai deck, be able to put a lot of different kinds of pressure on the board. And then we cut all the mana creatures and played Growth Spiral. And Growth Spiral was a bit of an oddball at the time. Again, every version of the Sultai deck we could find played mana creatures. Even the Hadana's Climb version that we started with was playing Incubation Druid because of the synergy with Hadana's Climb. You Incubation Druid on 2, Climb on 3, put the counter on, move to main phase 2, now you've got access to 3 more mana. You can play another creature. Get really far ahead that way. Well, the problem is the Incubation Druid died a lot. And a lot of the hands that you would keep that were kind of flimsy but were powerful if your mana creatures lived would get you just stone cold dead if they died. Whether you were playing against, mono blue and they got you with a Merfolk Trickster play, or you were playing against, the other mid-range decks and they had the removal, or you were playing against the mono red decks or the aggressive red decks and they just burned your mana creatures instead of going upstairs. If your opponent understood what the matchup was about, the mana creatures were a liability. So we cut them. I'm not going to say it was the best decision ever, because clearly it didn't work out in the result. Nick started the day 3-0 and then lost to eventual Grand Prix champion Jody Keith, and then got thrown into a bracket where he played against he played against 2 more decks we'd never seen. Naya Angels, and I can't remember what the other one was. And that's not a knock on those decks. They clearly came with a plan, it just didn't work out for them. Same goes for us. We came with a plan, it didn't work out for us. But that doesn't mean it's not a lesson we can learn from. Because when we tested the Sultai Mirror with the growth spirals over the mana creatures, it was a whole different matchup. Because we could spend turn 2 doing nothing. We could just represent a combination of removal and then card draw and ramp. And the draw was not nothing, turboing through the deck a little faster. Like the fact that it replaced itself and then would give you a ramp. That made it an infinitely better top deck in the middle of the game than just drawing a mana creature, which is like drawing another land. You know, even drawing an incubation druid in the middle of the game when you both drawn a ton of lands is not very good. It's just 3 more mana next turn if I draw a spell. We didn't have creature lands to sink that mana into. We didn't have something like the Scarab God to just sit there on the board and give you that mana sink. We didn't have anything like that. So, we played Growth Spiral. And it came up. And it got caught in top deck mode. Drew for the turn. Cast Growth Spiral. Draw. Cast Find Finality. Get back Krasis, cast Krasis, draw a bunch of cards. Like, that doesn't happen if your top card is a mana creature. You just lose that game. And that was one of his early round game 3s. One of the game 3s that decided a match was decided by the fact that he was able to Growth Spiral into action to then cast in the middle of the game when he was top decking. So the fact that it was both a redraw in the middle of the game, the fact that it served the same purpose as the mana creatures, except it dug deeper into the deck, allowing more action to come forth, and the fact that it ramped in a way that people were not interacting with, gave him an edge in the mirror that he just ultimately was never able to exploit. We were a version of Sultai Midrange that was tuned to beat the mirror, and then we never played against the mirror. So, you know, things happen. We hate them when they do sometimes, but things happen. So what's the biggest lesson? So what did that end up making this deck look like? Well, it looked like Sultai Midrange with just a little bit of a different identity. You know, we still had all the trappings of Sultai Midrange. We had Wild Growth Walkers. We had Merfolk Branch Walkers. We had Jade Light Rangers. I think we played 25, 26 lands. I can't remember for sure. I want to say it was 25, but we may have bumped up to 26. We played Chupacabras. We played Vivian Reeds. We played, you know, what else did we end up doing? Carnage Tyrant to be a bigger piece of synergy with the Hadana's Climb. We played 2 copies of Hadana's Climb. We played Assassin's Trophy. We played Vraska's Contempt. We played all the things that made Sultai Midrange good. We played Cast Down. We played notably we played Golden Demise instead of Cry of the Carnarium because of the fact that we didn't want to accidentally kill our own stuff and exile it. And then in the sideboard, we did the things that Sultai did in the sideboard. Of course, we had the Hydroid Crisis in the main, all 4 of them. And then in the sideboard, we had, what did we have? We had the Thief of Sanities that we weren't playing in the main board. And then we had Negates, and we had, if I'm not mistaken, we ended up playing Thought Erasure in the board. I can't remember for sure. It's been a while, and we didn't save a printed copy of the deck list. But the long and short of it is, we gained an advantage that was quantifiable by virtue of just taking what everybody else was doing and being willing to flip it on its head a little bit. Take the Sacred Cow that many said the deck would not function well without, and we cut them. And that is the definition of killing your darlings when you're building Magic decks. And that's going to be our topic on Homeward Path this week. The idea that sometimes going completely with the flow is not necessarily the correct thing. It's okay to step outside the box every now and then. I didn't. I probably should have. I'm not saying, like, we would not have been able to field two versions of the same Sultai deck. We just didn't have the cards between the two of us. But there was a version of the mono blue tempo deck that I was testing that instead of playing just counter magic and a couple of bounce spells as interaction with creatures, I was actually playing hard removal, a black splash, and had cut the sacred cow that was Tempest Gen in favor of Thief of Sanity because it was better against the Esper decks and it was way better against the Sultai decks. Because the second I got to untap with Thief of Sanity, that game was basically over because that thing was never going to die. You know, the ridiculous amount of card drawing that the mono blue deck had access to, even after making the changes to play the removal spells, it wasn't nothing. And then the ability to play my deck and my opponent's deck while still, you know, representing the ability to interact on a one-for-one basis and just draw cards with Curious Obsession. It gave me a decidedly more aggro control feel than it did the kind of Delver-esque feel that Mono Blue had. And it was something I regretted a little bit for a while after Memphis, was not going with what I'd been working on. I went with what the Hive Mind had told me was good. And the deck was still fine. Like, there was nothing wrong with it. I just wish I'd listened to myself. I trusted myself a little more. Because odds are my result would have been about the same. So I could have at least gotten some valuable information from the experience. So that's going to wrap it up this week, everybody. Thanks again for watching. You got questions, comments, concerns, ideas, whatever, put them down there. Or put them in, digital writing form and send them to me on Twitter. I'm at Homeward Path MTG. Send them on Facebook. My name is Adam Spain, like the country. Send them on the Facebook group for the pseudo network, if you will, the Homeward Pathfinders. It's where we all get together to talk about the show or content or whatever. If you're a patron of the show, you'll have access to the Homeward Path Discord, and one of the benefits to being a $3 or more patron a month is to get access to getting your deck published on this show. We'll break it down. We'll talk about what I love about it, what I don't like about it, where I think it lines up, like all of that in a public forum. And then, speaking of being a patron of the show, if you want to do that, head over to patreon.com/HomewardPathMTG. This show and every other on this pseudo network will always be free. But if you like what I'm doing enough to help me keep doing it, I'm not going to say no to the help. So that's going to wrap it up for this week, everybody. Thanks again. I will see you, you'll hear from me Thursday evening on the Homeward Path. Thanks again.